Hey guys, Lost Legacies Channel welcomes you. Tonight we are going to travel back to the very dawn of civilization, to a time before Rome, before the pyramids, before even the written word was common. We're headed to the sun-scorched plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, to uncover the world's first attempt at organized justice, the forgotten laws of ancient Sumer. You're about to stand in the world's first cities, under the shadow of towering ziggurats, and listen to the logic that transformed chaotic human settlements into the foundation for every society that followed. But be warned, this isn't a gentle place. Between the complete lack of modern medicine and a diet that was probably 90% gritty barley bread, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than a week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from, so please feel free to post your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is thick with the smell of dust, river water, and the distant aroma of baking bread mixed with livestock. You are standing in the city of Ur, one of the shining jewels of ancient Sumer more than 4,000 years ago. The sun is a relentless, white-hot disk in the sky, baking the mud brick walls of the houses around you. Life here is both simple and profoundly complex. Before now, in the mists of prehistory, disputes were settled simply by the strength of your arm or the sharpness of your spear. If someone wronged you, your only recourse was personal revenge. It was a world of chaos, of blood feuds that could last for generations, a world where the strong simply took what they wanted from the weak. But you are here at a turning point in the human story. You are here to witness the birth of an idea that is, in its own way, more revolutionary than the wheel, the idea of written law. You make your way to a public square where a scribe is working. He is not writing on paper with a pen, but pressing a wedge-shaped stylus into a tablet of wet clay. With each precise push, he creates the cuneiform script of his people. And the tablet he is copying is not a poem or a tally of grain. It is a set of rules for everyone to see. This is the code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest surviving law code in the history of the world. It's a mainstream historical fact that this collection of laws predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by about 3 centuries, establishing it as our earliest glimpse into formal justice. Found only in fragmented copies, it is a blueprint for an orderly society. And here is where you find the oddly soothing logic. These laws are not just a list of punishments. They are a promise of predictability. As you read the wedges, you realize that for the first time, your rights don't depend on who you know or how strong you are. If a man accidentally floods your barley field while irrigating his own, there is a specific written rule for how he must compensate you. If you hire a boatman and he sinks your cargo, there is a set penalty. This is the end of the arbitrary. It is the beginning of a system. It's the quiet, comforting knowledge that there are rules and that those rules apply to everyone. Historians still argue whether these early codes were actual, enforceable legal statutes that judges consulted daily, or if they were more of a royal monument, a form of propaganda for the king to display his wisdom and piety to the gods and his people. Were they law books or manifestos of a just kingship? The truth is likely somewhere in between. But as you watch the scribe work, you can't help but be struck by the straightforwardness of it all. One of the surviving laws is a quirky yet profound tidbit about personal injury. If a man cuts off another man's foot, the penalty is 10 shekels of silver. There's no talk of vengeance or cutting off the offender's foot in return. It is a simple, transactional, and oddly calm resolution. It's the ancient world's version of a very specific insurance claim payout, designed not to escalate violence, but to end it. These scribes weren't just making lists, they were building a civilization, one clay tablet at a time. You look up from the cool, heavy clay tablet in your hands, the wedges of cuneiform seeming to swim in the hazy heat. The scribe has moved on to his next task, but the idea he was transcribing lingers with you. A law to prevent a man from being wrongfully accused a law to define the penalty for a careless boatman. It all seems so practical. But why here? Why did this specific society, in this specific place, feel such an urgent need to write everything down? To understand, you must look beyond the city walls. You leave the bustling streets of Ur behind and walk towards the lifeblood of this entire civilization, the river. You are in a land the ancient Greeks would later name Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the mighty Tigris and the powerful Euphrates. As you stand on the muddy bank, you can feel the immense energy of the water. It is slow, brown, and pregnant with the rich silt that makes this arid land fertile. This is the great paradox of Sumer. The rivers are the source of all wealth. Every stalk of barley, every date palm, every fat, bleating sheep owes its existence to this water. But the rivers are also agents of absolute chaos. The spring floods are unpredictable and violent, capable of washing away entire villages in a single night of churning, muddy fury. Life here is a constant, delicate negotiation between creation and destruction. This environment is what gave birth to the world's first cities, a mainstream historical fact that places you at the very cradle of urban living. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small, nomadic bands. Then came the first farming villages. But this, the bustling metropolis of Ur, the legendary ramparts of Uruk, this is something entirely new. You are surrounded by thousands of people you have never met. They are not your family, not your clan. They are strangers, all packed together, all vying for the same resources. The old ways of keeping the order through family ties and social shaming simply don't work at this scale. Before written laws, the legal system was basically might makes right, which is a terrible system if you're not the strongest person around. The city creates new and wonderfully tedious problems that demand solutions. What happens when your neighbor's escaped ox eats the barley you were planning to trade for a new set of pots? What happens when a merchant sells you wool that is lighter than he claimed? But the most critical issue, the quirky tidbit that underpins Sumerian society, is the management of the water itself. You look out across the plains and see a shimmering network of man-made canals, a complex web of ditches and channels that divert the river's water to the distant fields. This irrigation system is a collective miracle of engineering. It is also the source of endless, potentially fatal conflict. Historians still argue whether the law was created in response to the complex problems of city life, or if the very existence of a legal framework was a prerequisite that allowed cities to grow so large in the first place. Did the problems demand a solution, or did the solution enable the growth that created the problems? It's a classic chicken and egg debate. But as you watch two farmers arguing heatedly over the opening of a sluice gate, you understand the necessity. If the farmer upstream takes too much water, your crops wither and die. If your neighbor downstream fails to dredge his section of the canal, it silts up, flooding your field and ruining your harvest. These aren't trivial matters. They are the difference between prosperity and starvation. These canal disputes were the ancient world's version of a heated homeowners association meeting, but where a violation could lead to a famine instead of just a strongly worded letter. This is the soothing logic of Sumerian law. It wasn't an abstract philosophy. It was a user manual for a new and complicated way of living. It was a tool designed to manage the chaos of both the natural world and the new unnatural reality of the city. The law tells you exactly how much water you are entitled to, what your responsibilities are for maintaining the canal, and what compensation you are owed if someone else's negligence harms you. It is a system designed to turn down the temperature, to resolve disputes with predictable rules rather than violent retribution. These laws were the very engineering that allowed the fragile canals of civilization to flow without collapsing. You stand, looking out at the vast, shimmering network of canals that give life to the dry earth. You understand now that these laws, pressed into humble clay, were the engineering blueprint for this new urban society. But every blueprint needs an architect, an ultimate authority that gives the rules their power. If a neighbor ignores the law and diverts the water, what stops you from simply taking matters into your own hands? What makes this clay tablet more powerful than a bronze spear? To find the answer, you turn your gaze from the fields and toward the heart of the city, toward the immense man-made mountain that dominates the skyline. You are walking through the sacred precinct of Ur in the shadow of the Great Ziggurat. It is a colossal, three-tiered structure of solid mud brick, a stairway to the heavens designed to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. The air here feels different, heavy with the scent of cedar incense and roasting barley from the temple offerings. This is the home of the city's patron deity, the moon god Nana. And it is from here, from the realm of the Legacies, that the law draws its ultimate, unshakable authority. For the Sumerians, law was not a human invention. It was a divine gift, a mainstream historical fact central to their entire worldview. The prologue to the Code of Ur-Nammu, which you saw being copied in the square, makes this perfectly clear. It is not a document written by a committee of lawyers. It is a sacred text. It states that the supreme gods of the cosmos, Anna and Enlil, handed dominion over the earth to the moon god Nana, who in turn chose the king, Ur-Nammu, to be his representative on earth. The king's primary duty was not to conquer, but to establish justice in the land. Disobeying the law, therefore, was not merely a crime against your neighbor or the king. It was an act of defiance against the divine order of the universe. It's a pretty effective way to ensure compliance when the ultimate appeal court is staffed by all-powerful cosmic beings. This divine connection was woven into the fabric of daily justice. While Nana was the patron of Ur, the god most associated with law itself was Utu, the sun god. As the sun, he blazed a path across the sky each day, seeing everything that happened below. He was the god of truth and the enemy of darkness and lies. Oaths and legal proceedings were sworn in his name, a solemn act that invited the god himself to witness the testimony. He was the original all-seeing CCTV camera, ensuring that every transaction and every promise made under the light of day was honest. Historians still argue whether the temples and the priesthood initially held the primary legal authority, which was later centralized by powerful kings, or if the king's secular power and the temple's religious authority always operated in a complex, sometimes competitive partnership. But the imagery is clear. The quirky tidbit is that abstract concepts like truth and justice, Kitu and Mishiru in the Akkadian language that followed, were sometimes depicted as living deities, divine attendants who stood by the sun god's throne. In famous carvings, the god hands the king a rod and a coiled rope, the tools of a divine architect, symbolizing the power to measure the land and establish a righteous, straight order. These are not mere symbols of power, they are the literal instruments of divine justice, passed from God to king. You realize now that the entire city is a courtroom. The temple gates, the city square, the riverbank, all are places where divine judgment could be felt. The laws on that clay tablet are not just practical rules for managing canals, which we discussed before. They are an attempt to replicate the perfect, cosmic order of the heavens down here on the messy, chaotic earth. The logic is soothing because it is absolute. The rules are fair not because a king said so, but because they are a reflection of the will of the gods themselves, a divine blueprint for how humans ought to live together in peace. You descend the Great Ziggurat, leaving the rarefied air of the baths and returning to the dusty, noisy, profoundly human world of the city streets. The divine principles of justice are awe-inspiring, but how do they actually function down here, in the chaos of the marketplace? How does a god's will translate into a verdict over a stolen animal? You soon find out as you are drawn toward a commotion near the city gate. The scene is a common one in any age. A man is shouting, his face red with anger and panic, gesturing wildly. He is a farmer who came into the city to trade. His ox, his most prized possession, has vanished from the post where he tethered it. In a lawless time, this is the spark that ignites a firestorm of violence. Accusations would fly, knives would be drawn, and blood would be spilled. But this is Sumer. This is a society with a blueprint. Instead of forming a mob, the men around the farmer begin to speak of the law. You follow the aggrieved farmer as he brings his case before a local official. Here you witness the core principle of Sumerian justice regarding property crime, a mainstream historical fact that sets it apart from many later codes. The focus is overwhelmingly on restitution, not retribution. The goal is not to make the criminal suffer, but to make the victim whole again. The logic is soothingly practical. The farmer doesn't want the thief's head on a pike. He wants his ox back, or at least the value of it. The law is a mechanism to achieve that in the calmest way possible. An ox, you realize, isn't just an animal here. It's a family's tractor, its savings account, and its retirement plan all rolled into one. Its theft is a modern-day grand theft auto, and the law treats the matter with economic seriousness. The official listens patiently and then cites the rule, a law very similar to one found in the Code of Ur-Nammu. If a man is caught as a thief, he must pay a fine, often a steep multiple of the stolen item's value. If the thief cannot pay the fine, he becomes a slave to the person he wronged, forced to work off his debt. There is no mention of flogging or mutilation for a simple theft. The system is less let the punishment fit the crime and more let the reimbursement fit the crime, with a hefty surcharge for the inconvenience. The quirky tidbit that reveals the depth of their legal thinking is how they handled nuance. What if the thief wasn't really a thief? What if another farmer found the ox wandering loose in the fields and, failing to find the owner, simply took it home to care for it? The law made a distinction. If you found a lost animal, you were required to bring it before official witnesses. If you failed to do so, you were considered a thief, even if your intentions were good. They were already dealing with the principle of finders keepers and deciding it wasn't a valid legal defense. They even had laws for false accusations. If you accuse your neighbor of stealing your ox but can't produce any evidence or witnesses, you are the one who has to pay a fine for disrupting the peace. Historians still argue whether this clear shift from corporal punishment to monetary fines was a sign of a more humane and enlightened society, or simply a more practical legal system for an increasingly complex economy. Was this the birth of compassion, or was it just good business? In a world built on agriculture and trade, perhaps restoring the economic balance was simply more important to the stability of the state than satisfying a personal need for revenge. As you watch the proceedings, you see the soothing logic at work. The anger of the farmer is channeled into a formal process. The crime is transformed from a personal insult into a civic problem with a predetermined solution. No one is calling for blood. They are calculating the market value of livestock. This is the genius of the Sumerian system. It is a legal code designed not for gods or kings, but for farmers, merchants, and neighbors who had to find a way to live together without letting every dispute escalate into a violent, society-shattering feud. You've seen how the theft of an ox is settled not with a blood feud, but with a calculated fine. The logic is practical, designed to restore economic balance. But it leaves you with a lingering question. What happens when the thing that is damaged is not property, but a person? In a world of hard physical labor, hot tempers, and readily available bronze tools, conflict is inevitable. What is the price of a broken bone? You get your answer near the city's canal works, where a heated argument between two laborers over a misplaced shovel has escalated into a fight. One man shoves the other, who stumbles and falls with a sickening crack. His leg is clearly broken. The aggressor looks on in horror, not at the prospect of a vengeful mob, but at the thought of the law. Most people, when they think of ancient legacies, recall one famous phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This principle is known as lex talionis, the law of retaliation. It's a mainstream historical fact that this concept was the cornerstone of the later, more famous Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. It feels primal, brutal, and yet strangely fair. But as the injured man is helped to his feet by his fellow workers, you learn something remarkable about the Sumerians. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the blueprint for their society, almost entirely rejects this idea. Just as with the stolen ox, physical injury is not met with physical retribution. It is met with a fine. The Sumerians had, in essence, a detailed price list for personal injury. It is a catalog of mayhem with a specific monetary value attached to each act. As the city official arrives to assess the situation, you can almost hear him mentally consulting the statutes. According to the surviving fragments of the code, if you smash a man's limb with a club, the penalty is 1 mina of silver. If you sever another man's foot, the fine is 10 shekels. If you cut off a man's nose with a copper knife, you must pay 2/3 of a mina. If you knock out his tooth, the fine is a more manageable 2 shekels of silver. It's a bizarrely transactional approach to violence, like a very painful and specific insurance schedule. The logic, however, is soothingly designed to maintain social harmony. The system provides the victim with tangible compensation for their injury and suffering, while simultaneously preventing an endless cycle of revenge. The injured man's family will not seek to break the aggressor's leg in return. Instead, they will receive a payment that can help them survive while the man is unable to work. It is a system built to de-escalate, not to punish. Legal historians still argue whether the Sumerian system of fines represents an earlier, more primitive stage of law that later evolved into the eye for an eye retribution seen in Hammurabi's code, or if it was actually a more advanced and socially stable system that later societies regressed from. Was the move toward physical retaliation a step forward in legal sophistication, or a step back toward more primitive vengeance? The Sumerian concern for personal harm wasn't limited to the physical, which brings us to a quirky tidbit from their laws. They had statutes against slander. One law states that if a man accuses another man's wife of promiscuity, the accused woman must undergo the trial by river ordeal, which we will explore later. If the river proves her innocent, the man who made the accusation must pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. This is extraordinary. It is a legal recognition of reputational damage, and it shows a sophisticated understanding that harm can be done with words as well as with weapons. It was, in effect, the world's first and most expensive fact-checking service. As the dispute at the canal works is resolved, you see no signs of escalating conflict. The matter is being handled. A price has been determined for the pain, and the community can move on. The Sumerian legal mind, you conclude, was profoundly pragmatic. Their laws were a tool to mend not just broken bones, but the fractures that violence creates in the fragile fabric of a society. You've seen how Sumerian law pragmatically handles public conflicts, from a stolen ox to a broken bone, always aiming to restore balance rather than exact revenge. But how does this soothing, transactional logic apply to the most intimate and emotionally complex area of human life? You now turn your attention from the street to the home to discover that in ancient Sumer, the matters of the heart, love, marriage, and even divorce were far too important to be left to chance. They were enshrined in law. You find yourself invited into the cool, shaded courtyard of a Sumerian home. The thick, mud brick walls insulate you from the relentless heat of the afternoon sun. The air smells of roasting barley and onions, and you can hear the gentle, rhythmic thumping of a woman weaving at a loom in a nearby room. A marriage in this world is not just an affair between two people. It is a critical economic and social alliance between two families. Its stability is the bedrock of society, and as such, it is governed by a formal, written contract. This is a mainstream historical fact of Mesopotamian life. A marriage was not legally valid without a contract inscribed on a clay tablet. This was the ancient world's most serious prenuptial agreement. You can almost picture the two families sitting down, a scribe between them, carefully outlining the terms. The contract would specify the bride price, a payment from the groom's family to the bride's, and, just as importantly, the dowry, which was the wealth the bride brought with her. This dowry, often consisting of furniture, jewelry, and even land or slaves, was not simply absorbed into the husband's property. Legally, it remained hers, a crucial financial protection. Signing a legally binding clay tablet before the wedding certainly makes the modern stress of choosing a cake flavor seem trivial. Here, in the laws governing family, you find some of the most surprisingly progressive ideas in the ancient world. This is the quirky tidbit that challenges many assumptions about the past. While Sumer was undoubtedly a patriarchal society, the law afforded women significant rights. A man could divorce his wife, but he was often required to pay a substantial fine and, crucially, had to return her dowry in full, preventing him from divorcing her simply to enrich himself. More remarkably, women had the right to initiate divorce as well, particularly in cases of cruelty or neglect by the husband. The law even accounted for the grim realities of a world constantly at war. One statute addresses the difficult situation of an agunutu, a wife whose husband has been captured in battle and is presumed dead. She was expected to wait for him, but if she had no other means of support, the law pragmatically allowed her to move in with another man and have children without being considered an adulteress. However, if her first husband ever returned, she was legally obligated to go back to him. It's the most complicated relationship status in history, but it reveals a deep, compassionate logic designed to protect women from destitution. Historians still argue whether these written laws reflect the day-to-day reality for all Sumerian women, or if they represent an ideal legal standard that was primarily accessible to the literate, upper-class families who could afford to draw up such contracts. Did the wife of a poor barley farmer enjoy the same legal protections as the daughter of a wealthy merchant? It's likely that access to justice then as now was not always equal. Still, the intent of the law is clear. It sought to create stable families by providing a framework of predictability and protection. As you watch the woman of the house direct her servants and manage her household's accounts, you realize her authority is not just a matter of personality, but a matter of law. Her financial contributions are protected and her status is secure. The soothing logic of Sumerian law extends from the canals and marketplaces right into the heart of the family home, ensuring that the foundational building blocks of their society were as solid and well-constructed as the city walls. You've seen how Sumerian law brings a predictable order to the family home, turning the most personal relationships into stable, contractual alliances. Now you step back out from the private courtyard into the noisy, chaotic, and vital world of the city's economy. You wander through the marketplace, the air thick with the scent of cumin, roasting goat, and the yeasty aroma of the city's favorite beverage. You soon find yourself ducking into the cool, dim interior of a Sumerian tavern to escape the oppressive sun. Here you discover that the law's reach extends even to the price of a cup of beer. The tavern is a lively hub of social life. Laborers, merchants, and off-duty soldiers sit on low benches, drinking a cloudy, nutritious beer from large clay jars through long reed straws to bypass the bits of grain floating on top. Beer here is not a luxury, it's a fundamental part of life. It's a source of calories, a social lubricant, and was often used as a form of payment for state laborers. Given its importance, it's no surprise that the Sumerians and their successors had very specific laws to regulate its production and sale. This is a mainstream historical fact of Mesopotamian life. Their law codes were deeply concerned with economic fairness and consumer protection. Later codes, like that of Hammurabi, would famously sentence a tavern keeper, often a woman known as an alewife, to death by drowning for serving a short measure of beer. While the surviving fragments of Ur-Nammu's code aren't quite so harsh, the principle was the same. The state regulated commerce to ensure honesty. This was the ancient world's first attempt at a better business bureau, and their enforcement methods were considerably more dramatic. The same logic applied to all commerce. The king established official, standardized weights and measures. The shekel for weight, the sila for volume, and using fraudulent scales was a serious offense. Economists and historians still argue whether these price controls and regulations were designed primarily to protect consumers and the poor from exploitation, or if their main purpose was to ensure the stability of the state's own income, since the temples and palace were the largest economic players and relied on fixed ratios for collecting taxes and paying rations. Was this about social justice, or was it about protecting the palace's bottom line? The soothing logic of this system is the trust it created. When you bought a sila of flour, you could be reasonably sure you were getting a full sila. This brings us to the quirky tidbit of the salty miller. The law had to be incredibly specific to deal with the clever ways people tried to cheat the system. One such law targeted millers who would adulterate the flour they were grinding for a customer. They might add cheaper, heavier substances like salt to the flour to increase its weight, allowing them to keep a portion of the pure flour for themselves. The law specifically addressed this kind of fraud, showing an incredible attention to the day-to-day realities of the marketplace. It was the world's first regulation against hidden ingredients and deceptive product filling. As you sit in the tavern, sipping the beer, you understand the comfort these laws provided. You know the alewife can't swindle you because her business and life could depend on her honesty. The farmer who grew the barley and the merchant who sold it were all bound by the same system of weights, measures, and contractual obligations. The law was the invisible referee in every transaction, ensuring a level playing field. It allowed a city of strangers to engage in commerce with a degree of trust, knowing that if a deal went sour, their recourse was not a knife in an alley, but a hearing before an official who would consult the calm, predictable logic written on a clay tablet. You are sitting in the cool shade of the tavern, the taste of barley beer still on your tongue. You've seen how the law governs the tangible world of beer and barley, of honest scales and fair prices. It is a system built on evidence, contracts, and witnesses, the bedrock of trust in a bustling economy. But what happens when trust breaks down completely? What happens when a crime is committed in the shadows, with no witnesses? When a dispute becomes one person's unprovable word against another's? For these impossible cases, you discover, the Sumerians turned from their man-made laws back to the ultimate divine arbiter of truth, the river itself. You follow a solemn procession leaving the city and heading toward the banks of the Euphrates. The mood is heavy, a stark contrast to the lively marketplace. A woman is being led by temple guards, her face a mask of fear. An accuser walks behind her, his expression a mixture of righteousness and anxiety. A serious charge has been leveled, perhaps the accusation of adultery we spoke of earlier, or an even darker charge, sorcery. There is no evidence, no witness, no confession. And so, they have come to ask the river god to be the judge. You are about to witness the trial by river ordeal, a mainstream historical fact of Mesopotamian justice. This was not a punishment, but a terrifying method of divine fact-finding. The accused is to be cast into the holy river. The logic passed down from the gods is simple and absolute. The river knows the truth. If the accused is guilty, the river will claim them, and they will sink. If they are innocent, the river will protect them, and they will float. It is the ultimate lie detector test with the highest possible stakes. Being a good swimmer was a very useful and potentially life-saving skill in ancient Sumerian legal disputes. This practice seems like the opposite of the calm, transactional laws you've seen so far. But from the Sumerian perspective, it possessed its own kind of soothing logic. It provided a definitive, final answer to a dispute that would otherwise fester and poison the community with suspicion and doubt. The ordeal promised to cut through the messy he said, she said, and deliver a clear divine verdict that no one could question. It was also a powerful deterrent against making false accusations. The law was often a double-edged sword. If the accused was proven innocent by the river, the accuser would have to face a severe penalty, sometimes the very same fate the accused would have suffered. You had to be very, very certain before you called upon the river god. Historians and archaeologists still argue whether the trial by river ordeal was a genuine test of fate with a random chance of survival, or if it was a highly ritualized event where priests who knew the river's treacherous currents and eddies intimately could subtly influence the outcome based on their own prior investigations or social pressures. Was the verdict truly in the hands of the gods, or was it often decided before the accused even touched the water? The quirky tidbit lies in the consequences for the accuser. The Code of Hammurabi, which inherited this practice, makes it devastatingly clear. In the case of a sorcery accusation, if the accused survives the river ordeal, the accuser is to be put to death, and the now proven innocent accused gets to take possession of the accuser's entire house and estate. It's a powerful disincentive, the ancient world's most effective system for preventing frivolous lawsuits and trolling. As the priests begin their incantations on the riverbank, you feel the oppressive weight of the moment. For the Sumerians, this was not a descent into chaos, but the ultimate application of order. When human systems of evidence and testimony reached their limit, they placed their trust in a divine system. The slow, muddy, impassive river was their court of last resort, their final, terrifying, and for them deeply logical, answer to the unknowable truth in a person's heart. The trial by river ordeal, with its terrifying finality, was reserved for the most serious and unprovable of crimes. And few crimes were considered more insidious, more disruptive to the divine order you've come to understand than the practice of sorcery. As the sun sets over the river, casting long dancing shadows, you retreat into the flickering lamplight of the city. Here in the encroaching darkness, you begin to appreciate the deep, primal fear that these laws were designed to contain. To understand the Sumerian view of witchcraft, you must first understand their world. For you, living 4,000 years ago, the world is not simply made of mud, water, and reeds. It is alive with unseen forces. The air hums with the presence of spirits, demons, and the restless ghosts of the dead. A sudden illness that strikes your child, a blight that withers your barley crop, a cow that gives no milk. These are not random misfortunes. They are often seen as the result of divine anger, or worse, the deliberate, malicious act of a neighbor who knows how to manipulate these dark forces. Fear of the supernatural is as real and constant as the heat of the sun. It's a mainstream historical fact that witchcraft was treated as a real and serious crime in all major Mesopotamian law codes. This was not about superstition, it was about security. A sorcerer was seen as a terrorist of the cosmic order. They were accused of usurping the power of the gods for their own selfish ends, of twisting sacred rituals into profane curses, and of attacking the community with invisible, indefensible weapons. The law against sorcery was, from their perspective, a matter of public health and national security. This is where you find the strange, soothing logic in their witch trials. The law provided a formal, state-sanctioned process for handling a threat that was otherwise invisible and terrifying. Instead of a paranoid mob forming to burn down a neighbor's house based on a rumor, the law required a formal accusation and a trial. That trial, as you've just learned, was the river ordeal, a definitive test. It channeled the community's raw fear into a predictable, if brutal, procedure. It gave people a sense of control in a world they believed was filled with uncontrollable dark magic. The most fascinating and quirky tidbit about these laws is how they were designed to protect against false accusations. The later Code of Hammurabi, which formalized many Sumerian legal ideas, contains a brilliant boomerang clause. The law states that if you accuse someone of witchcraft and they survive the river ordeal, proving their innocence, then you, the accuser, shall be put to death, and the person you accuse gets to take over your entire estate. This is the ultimate I told you so. This single rule is a work of legal genius designed specifically to stop people from weaponizing witchcraft accusations to settle petty grudges. You had to be absolutely, existentially certain your neighbor was cursing your goats before you filed a complaint, because the legal fees for being wrong were literally everything you owned. Scholars still debate the fine line between legitimate religious practice and illegal sorcery in Mesopotamia. Where did an acceptable prayer for a good harvest performed by a temple priest end, and a forbidden curse for a neighbor's ruin begin? The difference likely lay in intent, healing versus harming, and in social standing. Magic performed under the authority of the temple was a holy rite. Magic performed by an individual for personal gain was a dangerous crime. You realize that the law against sorcery was as much about protecting people from witches as it was about protecting people from each other's paranoia. It was a system that acknowledged a deep and genuine fear, but demanded the highest possible standard of proof before it would act. It was a heavy, terrifying shield, but a shield nonetheless, protecting the fragile order of the community from the chaos of the unseen world. You've witnessed the law's reach into the most hidden corners of Sumerian life, from the dark fear of a witchcraft accusation to the intimate contracts of the family home. You understand that its authority flows from the gods, and its power comes from its calm, predictable logic. But in a world of mortals, a divine blueprint is not enough. You need an earthly administrator, a final guarantor of justice. You now turn your attention from the temple and the riverbank to the imposing walls of the royal palace to understand the role of the one figure who connected the heavens to the earth, the king. You find yourself in the grand audience hall of the palace at Ur. The air is cool and smells of expensive cedar wood and imported incense, a stark contrast to the dusty heat of the city streets. Sunlight streams in from high windows, illuminating intricate carvings on the walls that depict the king not only as a mighty warrior, but also as a pious builder of temples. Petitioners wait in respectful silence. This is the center of power, and at its heart sits the king, who for the Sumerians was much more than a political ruler. He was the chief justice of the entire land. The mainstream historical fact that defines Sumerian kingship is the concept of the king as a shepherd to his people. This metaphor is woven into all of their royal inscriptions and is the ideological foundation of their society. A good shepherd protects his flock from wild animals, enemies, leads them to green pastures, ensures economic prosperity, and, crucially, keeps peace and order within the flock itself. The prologues to their law codes are, in essence, the king's sacred job description. In his code, Ur-Nammu explicitly states that he was chosen by the gods to establish justice, to ensure the orphan did not fall prey to the powerful, the widow did not fall prey to the rich, and the man of 1 shekel did not fall prey to the man of 60 shekels. This is the soothing logic of royal authority. It meant there was a final court of appeal. If you felt you were wronged by a local magistrate or that a powerful merchant was using his influence to cheat you, you theoretically had the right to bring your case before the king himself. He was the ultimate backstop, the protector of the vulnerable, the living embodiment of the divine principle of justice. His duty was to ensure that the rules weren't just written on clay, but were applied fairly to everyone, regardless of their station. Historians still argue about the extent to which the average Sumerian could actually access the king's justice. Was the right to appeal to the king a genuine legal avenue for all? Or was it a privilege reserved for the wealthy and well-connected, with the king's role being more symbolic than practical for the common farmer? The quirky tidbit is how seriously the kings took this role as a form of public relations. They constantly advertised their commitment to justice. A common practice was to name the years of their reign after their greatest accomplishments. While some years were named for military victories, many were named for legal and social reforms. A king might name a year, the year the king established justice in the land. It was a public broadcast of his primary virtue. Furthermore, many kings would issue a grand decree of justice, or equity, upon taking the throne, an edict which often included the cancellation of certain private debts and the freeing of citizens who had fallen into debt servitude. It was the ancient world's version of a massive student loan forgiveness program designed to reset the economic balance and start the new reign on a foundation of fairness. As you stand in the quiet grandeur of the hall, you see the king motion for a petitioner to approach. He leans forward, listening intently. You realize you are not just watching a ruler hold court, you are watching the anchor of an entire civilization at work. The order in the canals, the trust in the marketplace, the stability of the family it all flowed from the belief that at the very top of the system sat a man whose divine purpose was to be a just and righteous shepherd. You've seen the king on his throne, the great shepherd acting as the final guarantor of justice for his flock. But the king cannot be in every marketplace, field, and home at once. How does his divine mandate for order translate down to the millions of individual promises and transactions that happen every day? You leave the rarefied air of the palace and find the answer in a small, dusty workshop near the city gate, in the hands of a man shaping wet clay. You have found the world of the Sumerian scribe in the humble yet revolutionary world of the written contract. The room is cool and smells of damp earth and river water. Clay tablets, both wet and dry, are stacked neatly on wooden shelves, a library of agreements. A scribe sits on a low stool, listening intently as two merchants dictate the terms of a sale. With a reed stylus, he presses wedge-shaped cuneiform marks into a small, palm-sized tablet of clay. Here, you witness a mainstream historical fact of Mesopotamian life. They were one of the most contract-obsessed societies in history. Almost every significant interaction, business or personal, was recorded and made legally binding on these clay tablets. Since literacy was a specialized skill, the scribe was a vital professional, serving as a combination of lawyer, notary, and public record keeper. You watch in awe as agreements are finalized. A farmer takes out a loan of barley, with the interest rate clearly stipulated, to be paid back after the harvest. A woman rents a house for a year for a set amount of silver. Two families formalize an adoption. Every tablet follows a clear, logical structure. The names of the parties, the terms of the agreement, the date, often using the king's official year name as we discussed before, and a list of witnesses. To finalize the contract, each party, along with the witnesses, produces their own unique signature, a cylinder seal. These were small, intricately carved cylinders of stone that, when rolled across the wet clay, left a unique impression. It was a personal, forgery-proof mark of identity and consent. It was far more impressive than the messy scrawl of a modern signature. The most quirky and ingenious tidbit, however, was their method for preventing fraud. What if a dishonest merchant secretly altered the tablet after it was signed, changing a number by adding another wedge? The Sumerians developed a brilliant solution, the clay envelope. After the contract tablet was written and sealed, the scribe would take a fresh piece of clay, flatten it into a thin sheet, and wrap it completely around the original tablet, sealing it inside. Then he would painstakingly copy the entire contract text onto the outside of this clay envelope and have everyone roll their seals on it a second time. Archaeologists and historians still debate the primary function of the massive temple and palace archives where thousands of these tablets have been found. Were these archives a true public record office that citizens could consult to resolve disputes? Or were they primarily administrative tools for the state to track assets, calculate taxes, and control the economy? The genius of the clay envelope was that if a dispute arose years later, the judge could simply break the outer case in front of both parties. Inside, the original, pristine contract would be revealed, perfectly preserved from the moment it was first sealed. It was the world's first tamper-proof document, a read-only file that you had to physically smash to even attempt to edit. Holding one of these tablets in your hand, you feel its dense, reassuring weight. This is not just mud. This is trust made tangible. It is the king's justice, decentralized and distributed to every citizen who engaged in a transaction. It is the soothing logic of a society that valued predictability and fairness so much that they encased their promises in stone-hard clay, ensuring that a deal made today would be honored tomorrow. You've seen how the Sumerians encased their promises in clay, creating tangible trust for sales, loans, and even adoptions. But as you look over the scribe's shoulder at his library of tablets, you notice contracts for the sale of a different kind of asset, a person. This brings you face to face with the most difficult and uncomfortable aspect of this ancient world, an institution that existed at the very foundation of their economy, slavery. You find yourself on a large estate, the property of a wealthy priest or merchant. In the sweltering heat of the enclosed courtyard, people are hard at work. Some grind barley into flour, others carry water from the canals, and in the kitchens, the air is thick with the smoke from clay ovens. It's difficult at first to tell who is a free laborer and who is a slave. The work is equally hard for all, but the legal distinction is absolute. The mainstream historical fact is that slavery was an accepted and integral part of Sumerian society, but it was a complex institution, different from the race-based chattel slavery of later eras. There were three primary ways you could find yourself enslaved. The most common was being a prisoner of war. Entire populations of a defeated city could be brought back as spoils of victory. Another path was through debt. If you were a free citizen who fell into desperate debt, you could sell yourself, or even your children, into servitude for a period of time to work it off. Finally, if you were born to a slave mother, you inherited her status. The law treated slaves first and foremost as valuable property. You see this clearly in the case of the runaway slave, a scenario detailed in their law codes. A person who found and returned a runaway slave to their master was entitled to a handsome reward, paid in silver. Conversely, anyone caught harboring a runaway slave faced severe punishment. The logic here is cold and economic. The law is protecting a master's valuable asset, just as it protected the farmer's stolen ox. But this is where the picture grows more complex and reveals a fascinating, quirky tidbit about their society. While they were property, Sumerian slaves also possessed a surprising degree of legal personhood. The law granted them certain rights that challenge our modern understanding of slavery. A Sumerian slave could, for instance, own their own property. They could conduct business on the side and keep the profits. They could even borrow money to start a small venture. It's a bit of a mind bender, the idea of property owning property. Even more remarkably, a slave could marry a free citizen. The law codes went into specific detail about the status of the children born from such a union, a clear indication that it was not an uncommon occurrence. And most importantly, a slave who managed to accumulate enough wealth had the legal right to buy their own freedom. The path was incredibly difficult, but it existed. It was a codified escape hatch from a life of servitude. Historians and Assyriologists still debate how much these legal rights for slaves reflected their actual lived experience. Were these protections a genuine, accessible legal reality for the enslaved? Or were they rare exceptions in a system that was, for the vast majority, one of brutal exploitation and hardship? The clay tablets show us the law, but they cannot always show us the life. As you watch the workers on the estate, you see this complex reality in motion. The person grinding grain is both a tool owned by another and a human with a legally defined, albeit limited, identity. The soothing logic of the Sumerian system, you realize with a certain discomfort, was not about creating a moral or equal society in our modern sense. It was about creating a completely ordered and predictable one. The law's purpose was to define everyone's place in the social hierarchy, from the king on his throne to the slave in the field, and to provide a clear set of rules for how they must interact. It was a system designed to function, to endure, and to prevent the chaos that they feared above all else. You've seen how the law defined the status of every person within the Sumerian social hierarchy, from the king on his throne to the slave working in the field. But this entire complex society, this great pyramid of roles and responsibilities, rested upon one single fragile foundation: the barley harvest. To understand the most fundamental and fiercely protected laws of Sumer, you must leave the city's ordered streets and walk out into the vast, shimmering grid of the cultivated fields. You are standing on a raised earthen bank between two irrigation canals. All around you, the seemingly barren Mesopotamian plain has been transformed into a patchwork of impossible green. The air is heavy with the smell of wet earth and growing things. You can hear the gentle gurgle of water as a farmer opens a small sluice gate, guiding the life-giving liquid from a main channel into a smaller ditch that feeds his field. This entire landscape is an artificial creation, a massive hydraulic machine engineered for survival, and the laws that governed it were as rigid and important as the laws of physics. It is a mainstream historical fact that a huge portion of Mesopotamian legal codes were dedicated to the intricate rules of agriculture. Their entire civilization depended on it. As you watch farmers guide wooden plows pulled by oxen, you realize every aspect of their work is touched by the law. There were laws for renting fields, specifying the expected share of the harvest to be paid as rent. There were laws setting the wages for hired laborers. And as you'll recall, there were detailed laws for when one farmer's livestock wandered off and damaged another's crops. But the most critical laws, the ones that held the entire society together, were the laws of water. This brings us back to the canals. The quirky tidbit is the sheer specificity of these regulations. The later Code of Hammurabi, which built directly upon Sumerian legal tradition, has a law that perfectly captures this. If a farmer is negligent when opening his irrigation ditch and the water consequently floods his neighbor's field, he is legally required to repay his neighbor for the lost crops based on the yield of the surrounding fields. This points to the core concept of communal responsibility. Every farmer whose land touched a canal was legally obligated to maintain their section. This meant regularly dredging the silt that constantly threatened to clog the channel and reinforcing the earthen banks to prevent breaches. If your neglect led to a break in the canal that flooded the entire area, you were held liable for all the damages. If you couldn't pay, you and your family could be sold into slavery to cover the debt. It's the most intense neighborhood association agreement in history, where failing to maintain your property could lead to the complete ruin of your neighbors and yourself. Historians and archaeologists still argue over the primary model of land ownership in Sumer. Was most of the arable land owned directly by the temples in the palace and worked by tenant farmers, or was there a significant class of private, independent landowners who owned their fields outright? The answer dramatically changes our understanding of their economic and social structure. The soothing logic of these water laws is the logic of forced cooperation. They created a system where self-interest and community interest were legally bound together. You couldn't afford to be lazy or careless because the consequences were immediate, calculated, and severe. It was a system that managed a shared, precious, and life-or-death resource with absolute clarity. It prevented thousands of potential disputes from ever starting and provided a clear, nonviolent path to resolving those that did. The law was the invisible infrastructure that ensured the water, and with it, civilization itself kept flowing. You are standing on the bank of a canal, the water flowing just as it has for 1,000 years, regulated by laws as old as the city itself. But civilizations like the great rivers are never static. They rise, they fall, and they flow into one another. The ideas born here in the sun-drenched fields of Sumer did not vanish when its cities eventually lost their power. Instead, these legal principles flowed downstream through time, watering the foundations of new and even mightier empires. To see this legacy, you must let the centuries wash over you. The air itself seems to have changed. The language you hear on the streets is no longer Sumerian, but the guttural sounds of Akkadian. You are standing in a city that dwarfs even Ur in its grandeur and power. This is Babylon around the year 1754 BCE, during the reign of its most famous king, Hammurabi. And you are here to see the world's most famous legal document. You enter the Temple of Marduk and stand before a towering stele of black diorite, almost as tall as two men. This is the Code of Hammurabi, a mainstream historical fact and one of the most important legal artifacts ever discovered. At the very top of the monument is a carved relief. You see the sun god, Shamash, the same god the Sumerians called Utu, seated on a throne. Before him stands King Hammurabi, receiving the symbols of divine authority. The branding is identical to what the Sumerian kings used centuries earlier. The law is not a human invention, but a gift from the gods, and the king is its earthly administrator. As your eyes scan the hundreds of laws meticulously carved in cuneiform down the monument's face, you see the Sumerian legal DNA everywhere. The laws governing contracts, agricultural negligence, and family arrangements are all direct descendants of the principles first written on clay in Ur-Nammu. But you also notice a dramatic and fundamental shift, a quirky tidbit that has defined Hammurabi's legacy. While the Sumerian code dealt with personal injury through a system of fines, Hammurabi's code famously institutes the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The law is brutally direct. If a man breaks another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. This is a move from restitution to retribution. However, this famous principle came with a very important asterisk based on social class. The eye for an eye rule only applied between social equals. If a nobleman blinded a commoner, the penalty was not blinding in return, but a fine of 1 mina of silver. If that same nobleman blinded a slave, the fine was even less, half the slave's value. It was the ancient world's most brutal tiered subscription plan for justice, where the consequences of your actions depended entirely on who you were and who your victim was. Legal scholars and historians still debate why Hammurabi compiled and publicized his laws so famously. Was he a genuine social reformer, passionate about establishing justice for all? Or was he a brilliant political strategist using a unified legal code to consolidate his vast multicultural empire? By imposing a single divine-backed legal standard from the Persian Gulf to Syria, he wasn't just dispensing justice, he was building a cohesive imperial identity. Standing before this magnificent and intimidating monument, you see the long shadow of Sumer. Hammurabi's code was like a new software update. It kept most of the core operating system invented by the Sumerians, but introduced a few dramatic new features that would get all the attention for the next 4,000 years. The language was different, the punishments harsher, the social hierarchy more rigid, but the fundamental, soothing idea that a great society must be governed by a system of written public laws was a direct and unbroken inheritance from the people who first dared to write down the rules. You step back from the imposing black monument of Hammurabi, its cuneiform text a testament to a long-dead empire. It is a powerful legacy, but it is only a single mighty branch on a much older tree. To find the roots of this entire system, you let your mind travel back once more, past the grandeur of Babylon, past the conquests of Akkad, to the quiet, sun-drenched plains of Sumer. Here you can finally reflect on the true, lasting legacy of their forgotten order. The Sumerians have vanished into the dust of history. Their language is unspoken, their cities are ruins. But the ideas they etched into wet clay have proven more durable than any mud brick wall. It is a mainstream historical fact that the Sumerians, by being the first to write down their laws, established the very foundation of what we now call the rule of law. Every time you sign a contract, appeal to a court, or simply expect to be treated fairly under a known set of rules, you are enjoying the fruits of a tree planted in Mesopotamian soil more than 4 millennia ago. They were the first to articulate the principles that we now take for granted. The idea that justice is the responsibility of the state, not a matter for personal vengeance. The necessity of witnesses and evidence to prove a case. The concept of presumption of innocence hinted at in their laws against false accusations. And the deeply practical principle of restitution, the idea that the primary goal of justice should be to repair the harm that was done. They essentially beta-tested civilization for the rest of us, working out the initial bugs in the legal code. The quirky tidbit that reveals the sophistication of their system is the existence of a class of officials known as the mashkim. These were not lawyers who argued for a particular side, but more like court-appointed investigators or bailiffs. Court records show the mashkim were responsible for summoning defendants, ensuring witnesses were present, and investigating the facts of a case before presenting them to the judges. They were the first professional cogs in the machinery of justice, a crucial step beyond simply having a wise king issue a verdict. They were the bureaucracy that made the system work. Modern legal philosophers still debate the fundamental purpose of law, a conversation that began on these clay tablets. Is law's primary purpose to enforce a moral or divine code, to protect the property and power of the ruling class, or to create a pragmatic system that allows for the greatest good for the greatest number of people? The genius of Sumerian law is that it contains elements of all three. It was divinely inspired, it did protect the property of the temple and palace, but its greatest success was creating a stable, predictable framework that allowed a complex urban society to flourish. The final soothing logic of Sumerian law is this: it was a triumph of reason over chaos. It was the collective agreement that a predictable, known set of rules, however imperfect, is better than the arbitrary whim of the strong. It was the understanding that trust is the essential ingredient of civilization, and that written law is how you make trust tangible. Their world of oxen, barley, and canals may be alien to us, but the problems they tried to solve, how to live together peacefully, how to trade fairly, how to protect the vulnerable, are the same problems we are still trying to solve today. The order they created is forgotten, but its logic is written into the DNA of our own. And so our long journey through the dust of Mesopotamia comes to a soft and quiet end. Let the images of the towering ziggurats and the sun-baked clay tablets begin to fade now, dissolving into the gentle darkness. The murmur of the ancient marketplace and the solemn pronouncements of the king can soften into a distant, peaceful echo. The great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, which gave birth to this world of rules and order, now become a slow, lulling current, gently guiding you toward the shores of your own sleep. There are no more laws to decipher, no more complex contracts to read. All of the intricate details can drift away, leaving only the simple, soothing logic of rest. The ancient world has settled into a peaceful silence. Its work is done, and now so is yours. All that is left is to let go, to allow the quiet of the present moment to envelop you in its calm embrace, and to drift.